Okay, well, what we were doing last time, we were talking about this Keynesian model of the macroeconomy. If you'll remember, we had a diagram that looked like this for total expenditures. By the way, we just keep accumulating terms, don't we, down here on the horizontal axis. We're talking about real GDP, whether Keynes used this term of Y, and we've already been using these other terms, so really you can use whichever you like. Don't let it confuse you. We're talking about expenditures here, and here is total expenditures. Okay, and this total expenditure amount, the curve starts off at this point, the vertical intercept they call that. That is C0, that is autonomous consumption, plus investment spending, plus government spending, plus net exports. And I'll put a little 0 next to each one of these to show you that this is an autonomous amount of spending. This is total autonomous spending. And this term autonomous, I used it last time, but just to remind you again, autonomous spending does not depend on the level of income or GDP. It's just a certain amount. It's independent. I could have used the term independent, but autonomous is what economists normally say. It's independent of income. Independent of income, or Q. Okay, and then what we have above that, any increase in spending, they call this induced spending. It's induced as the level of GDP goes up or income goes up, then the spending level rises. And if you remember, we talked about that a little bit last time. We said that consumption spending has got an autonomous component plus, in addition to the autonomous, I think I used that letter Y last time, didn't I? Could use a Y, could use a Q. I'll just put that one above. But this is the Keynesian terminology, and here's the one that we've been using up until now. But anyway, this is the induced part of spending. It's induced by growing level of income and growing level of production in the economy, and then there's a greater spending amount. But the point is we've got autonomous spending, and then the growth that occurs is we use the term induced. Okay, so let me get that out of here. We did that mainly last time. What we did at the very end of the hour is I was talking about total production. And if you remember, total production is really, there's a very simple diagram for that. What we do in this diagram for total production, we say, and here we're measuring total production on the vertical axis. If GDP is $100, I don't know if I used GDP or, I mean, Y or Q last time, but if GDP is $100, what's the value of total production? And the answer is, it's also $100. So we can put a dot right there. And we could do the same thing if GDP is $200, total production is $200, and so forth. But anyway, the idea is that this is a 45-degree line showing total production. It just shows total production at various levels of GDP, real GDP. So now what we want to do is bring these together. So let me put my total production curve in the same diagram as the total expenditures curve. Now, in the Keynesian model, and you'll remember that Keynes wrote this stuff in 1936. He was talking about a deep depression case. There were plenty of unemployed resources. A company could just go out and hire workers without saying, oh man, there's a shortage of workers, what are we going to do? We've got to pay higher wages. We've got to offer them a package of fringe benefits that's attractive. You didn't have to say that in the 1930s. You just had to say, yeah, we've got a job, and people would show up. And so what Keynes was assuming here, you see that total production curve just go up, up, up. He was assuming that no matter how much GDP we wanted, we could produce more. And so this is assuming a passive aggregate supply. It was assuming that aggregate supply will just grow however much you want it to. How would it do that? Just by hiring unemployed resources. So, anyway, here's the Keynesian model with the, and by the way, we've already talked about this a little bit more, and right now we don't need to get into the discussion of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, but we talked about the horizontal aggregate supply curve as the Keynesian case. I don't think I used the term Keynesian. I said that's the Depression case. And that's all we're saying here is this passive aggregate supply. If aggregate demand grows, we just end up getting larger levels of real GDP. That's all that Keynes was assuming. But this is really the tools he used, total expenditures and total production, rather than aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Anyway, so this is the diagram. This point right here, and by the way, all the action in economics occurs where two lines cross. So two lines cross right here. This is the equilibrium level of real GDP in the Keynesian model. Okay? And of course, we're just using letters down here, but this was a certain amount. This would be like $142 billion or something like that. Right? So, equilibrium in the Keynesian model is right there. Now, suppose this is equilibrium, this QE, but suppose that we are not there. Suppose that, and let's put some numbers in here. Let's say equilibrium is $500 or $500 billion or whatever you'd like to use in terms of units. But let's say the equilibrium is 500, and suppose the actual, the current GDP is $300. Current. Equilibrium. What are we going to do? How will we fix this? And the answer is we don't have to fix anything. If the GDP is actually $300, but the equilibrium is $500, here's what will happen. Okay? Total production will be this amount. How much is that? Well, $300. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm crazy. This amount's $300 on the red line. $300, but total expenditures is a greater amount, let's say $400. So if we are currently at a lower level of GDP than the equilibrium is, then what happens is total spending, or total expenditures, is greater than total production. And what happens? What if spending is $400 and production is $300? What happens? And the answer is companies have to supply those customers, those buyers, they have to supply them out of inventories. And so a situation back here to the left where GDP is below equilibrium, what happens is that there's sales from inventories. Inventories are being drawn down. And when inventories are being drawn down, that's when the companies, the managers of the companies, they say, man, we're not producing enough to supply our customers. We're going to have to step up production, have the workers stay some overtime, hire some more workers or whatever. But the point is if we are at a lower level of GDP than the equilibrium is, then inventories will be drawn down and companies will start stepping up production. They will hire more workers, and when they do that and step up production, GDP is no longer going to be $300. Now there's more jobs, now there's more production, now there's more sales, and so what's happening is if we start off at a level of GDP that is not equilibrium, this situation cannot remain. This situation right here where we're not at equilibrium, it brings about an adjustment in the economy to move us to this level, this equilibrium level of GDP. Are you with me on that? Suppose that we started off over here at some point, 800. The equilibrium level of GDP is 500, but we are actually producing $800 worth of goods and services. Here's 800 up here. But total expenditures is only, let's say, $650. There's only $650 worth of spending to buy $800 worth of merchandise. What happens to this extra merchandise? And the answer is that's added to inventories. And after a while of adding to inventories, then the managers of those companies, they say, man, what are we going to do with all these inventories? We've filled up the back room, we're filling up warehouses, we're going to have to do something. And that's when they say to some workers, hey, we're going to take off Friday next week and try and reduce production a little bit and sell off some of these inventories. And so they start laying off workers. They don't hire new workers. And so what happens is, when workers are being laid off and not hired, they don't produce as much and GDP starts going down. So if we are at a greater level of GDP than is equilibrium, then GDP will decline. Decline to what? Well, decline to equilibrium. And so what I'm saying to you is, where these two curves cross is not just equilibrium because I say so, or Keynes said so. Where those two curves cross, total production and total expenditures, that's equilibrium, because if we start off at any other level, then we've got either inventories being drawn down or inventories being built up in an undesirable way, and managers of companies are going to take corrective action. And it's the corrective action. They don't care about the economy. They're not taking corrective action to bring the economy to equilibrium. They're taking corrective action because they're trying to bring their own situation to the, improve their own situation. We don't want to produce extra inventories that we can't sell. Or we don't want to be selling out of inventories forever. We need to get those inventories back up to their normal level. So company managers, just to solve their own situation, will bring the economy to an equilibrium. And so that point there, total production equals total expenditures, that's equilibrium. We always move toward equilibrium. And by the way, on a daily basis, and I don't mean to confuse you with this, but on a daily basis, this total expenditures curve could be shifting around. Boy, I just can't get that off. It can be the curve could be shifting around, and equilibrium could be moving. And so I don't mean to say that there's an equilibrium that just remains there forever and finally we work there. If the equilibrium moves, then it's a moving target. But always the tendency is to find that equilibrium, because we always have those inventories either being built up or being drawn down below undesirable levels. Okay, well, let me erase just a little bit and we'll take on another little problem here. We'll draw the same diagram. Here's the 45-degree line, total production. We'll draw a total expenditures curve. We see where the equilibrium is. This is, what do we say, Q, R, GDP, or Y. So we've got an equilibrium. Let's label that QE. Here's natural real GDP. Or that's real GDP at full employment. What do we call this situation? Well, we've seen this situation before back in the aggregate supply, aggregate demand material, but what we call that here is a recessionary gap. Why a recessionary gap? And the answer is we've got an equilibrium for the economy, and that equilibrium for the economy is at a lower level of GDP than full employment would bring about. If all the workers, really with full employment, we don't have everybody with jobs, of course. We have the natural rate of unemployment that, what I said, from 4.5% to 5.5%, about 5% unemployment rate. And that would just be frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, but no cyclical unemployment. So anyway, if we had full employment in the sense I just described it, then we would be producing this level of GDP, QN, but we're producing a smaller amount, and we call that a recessionary gap. Think back on what we've talked about before. If there's a recessionary gap and wages are flexible, what would happen is the surplus of workers now would come in and say, I'm willing to work for less. Wages would go down, aggregate supply curve shifts. We've already been through that material. But here Keynes says wages don't go down. And if wages don't go down, we're just there. This is what Keynes called unemployment equilibrium. So in Keynes's way of seeing things, where wages won't adjust and interest rates won't adjust and prices don't adjust and so forth, he says we just find ourselves at this spot. Here's the equilibrium level of GDP, and that's the end of the story. And do we have a recession? Yes, we do. Do we have cyclical unemployment? Yes, we do. Will that cure itself? No, it won't. Now, what I already showed you and what we just talked about before is if real GDP started off at some other level, let's say it was at Q1, we just saw a moment ago how inventories would be drawn down, and that would increase the level of production, but it would only increase it up to the equilibrium point. If somehow or another you could just put the economy there at QN and just say, okay, everybody's got a job and GDP is out here at QN, then there would be production over and above purchases, spending, and so we would have inventories being built up, and then what would happen is companies would lay off their workers and we move back to QE. So nothing that we've said so far tells us that we're going to eliminate this recessionary gap. Keynes said we're not, and in the model we're just not going to. We're going to have to live with a recession potentially forever. Now, Keynes had suggestions on what to do to eliminate this, but without taking his suggestions, we're stuck right here at the equilibrium point. Full employment is at a different level of GDP, and there's no way to get there. Let's draw a graph, another graph. I want to relate what we've been talking about to what we have seen earlier with aggregate supply and aggregate demand. I'm saying this is the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. We'll get an aggregate demand curve, AD. Let's give this not just a letter QE. Let me put a number on it. This equilibrium point, we'll say that's Q1, real GDP. And right over here, this will be Q1. And so we can, and over here someplace is QN, that's natural real GDP. I should put it further over to the right. Okay, now, let me see if I can show you. Let's shift this curve. Let's shift the total expenditure. And by the way, the 45-degree line never shifts, so it's just there. It remains in one spot. Let me shift this total expenditures curve upward. If you remember, we started off with autonomous spending, and it looks like autonomous spending's gone up. C0 plus I0 plus G0 plus XN. That's larger now than it was just a moment ago. Okay, so either households or businesses or the government or foreigners, somebody's spending more in the United States economy. The equilibrium would go now to Q2. Okay. Then we would come back over here, we see Q2. All we're talking about is a D2. I'm saying this increase in total expenditures, which increases our equilibrium GDP in this diagram, that corresponds to a shift, a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve from AD, I didn't put a 1 there, but AD1 to AD2. Now, if you will think back When we first drew the aggregate demand curve, I said, oh, what can shift the aggregate demand curve? And I said, well, increased consumption spending, increased spending by businesses, increased spending by government, increases in exports, decreases in imports, changes in the money supply. But I went through a list of things that can shift that curve. Really, all we're doing in this chapter, I mean, I'm putting the discussion around Keynes in the 1930s and all this kind of stuff, but basically what we have is this, is Keynes is showing us how that if consumption spending, autonomous consumption spending, would go up, this curve would shift upward, and Keynes's new equilibrium at Q2 just corresponds to a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And if this, and I'll put some dollar amounts in here, if this is $400 and this is $500, all that tells us is that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right by $100. This amount right here is $100. So that is the amount by which aggregate demand shifts to the right in the event consumption or investment or government spending or net exports goes up. Let me say this in a slightly different way. When Keynes put this thing together, he said, look, that's it. That's the whole world. You don't need anything else. Keynes just said, that's the story. Modern day economists don't believe that. What they say is, look, Keynes's story is really a story of aggregate demand. Keynes has shown us equilibrium beginning, the new equilibrium, if there's an increase in spending, and if there's a passive supply. Then Keynes has shown us how the economy reacts. Well, we don't think a supply is passive in our economy, and so we would want to draw a different aggregate supply curve. But if supply was passive and just respond to whatever the demand is, then Keynes has really just shown us his change in equilibrium is just the shift, the rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. We've taken Keynes from a sort of a total, this is all you need to know. We have reinterpreted that, where Keynes is now showing us the amount by which the aggregate demand curve shifts. Again, don't get too caught up in this because we'll come back to it later on, but there is a relationship between these two. If this curve shifts up, and we just saw this, but if the total expenditures curve shifts upward, that corresponds to a rightward shift or an increase in aggregate demand. So in a sense, there's not much, well, I shouldn't say there's not much new. Keynes did his stuff before aggregate demand and aggregate supply was done, so I guess in a sense, this is not much that's new. But in another sense it is, because we have an aggregate supply curve nowadays that doesn't look like that horizontal one Keynes was talking about. I didn't really want to extend that out past natural real GDP. Any questions about this? Okay, well, next topic. Well, same topic. Next whatever, subtopic. Let's pick a dollar amount here, 500. We'll start off with that equilibrium level of GDP. Draw that a little more carefully. It didn't look very straight to me. Maybe that's better. Kind of got a little bump in it right there, doesn't it? Normally I'm not so careful with those, but what I'm getting ready to show you, I want a little bit of precision in this. Let's do this. Let's shift that total expenditures curve upward, but let's shift it upward by just a small amount, and let's kind of pay attention when we shift that up. We'll just shift it up by this amount. And then draw a parallel line, so autonomous spending has gone up, TE2. by this amount. Let's draw the new equilibrium. Here's what I wanted to show you. This amount right here, these fingers apart, would give us to about this amount of new GDP. But gosh, here's what we notice is that even though the total expenditures curve shifted up by, and I'll just put an amount of money here. Let's say this curve shifted up by $50. If that's $50, I'm saying real GDP maybe went up to 600. Again, this is just a measurement issue. If we measure this shift, you might think total expenditures is up by $50, so GDP ought to rise by $50. But I'm saying it doesn't work that way. If GDP is up by if total expenditures shift up by $50, GDP in this particular case went up by $100. Shift in total expenditures less than change in GDP, equilibrium GDP. And that's what our diagram is showing. This is called the multiplier effect. Of spending. You'll hear about these multipliers probably for the rest of your life. I don't know if you've heard about it before, but if you have or haven't, you're going to hear about it in the future. I talk with people every once in a while on the phone. They'll call me up, and before you know it, the conversation's turned around to multipliers. There's a multiplier effect. And sometimes this is called a Keynesian multiplier. Although he didn't develop the idea. He didn't develop the idea, but the people who did really didn't do a whole lot with that idea. And Keynes came along and said, hey, I need that multiplier for my theory, and so he worked that into the discussion. Okay? So, how's this multiplier thing work? Total spending went up by $50, and I don't care how you draw it, as long if you got a 45-degree line there, every single time, if you shift this curve up by like 1 inch, you'll find the equilibrium is to the right by 2 inches or some other amount. Where does that multiplier come from? Let me make it clear about one thing right here. What's increasing is autonomous spending. So this is an increase in autonomous spending. MPC not changed. That is to say, the slope of the curve didn't change. I try to make those two curves parallel. Slope of the curve doesn't change. We're just increasing autonomous spending. Let's talk about how this works. And I'll use some simple examples. Let's make the MPC equals, let's say 50% for the moment, just because that's an easy number to work with. Here's what I'm saying will happen, and follow me here with the numbers. Suppose that somebody, let's say a foreigner comes to the United States and they spend, and we start off at equilibrium, $500. And a foreigner comes to the United States and spends $50. Here is $50. Goes into, I don't know, a grocery store and buys $50 worth of groceries. Here's what happened immediately, is that $50 comes into the cash register of the grocery store owner. And the grocery store owner says, hey, great, my revenues have gone up by $50. That's his gross income. And he's got to pay some of that out to workers, and some of it out to the people who supply vegetables, and some of it out to the ranchers or the butchers or whatever that supply the meat. But if he does pay that out, then it becomes the income of the rancher or the income of the butcher or the income of the farmer who grows the vegetables. So when the foreigner comes to the United States and spends that excuse me, that $50, the grocer and the butcher and the rancher and the farmer, all of them together, their income goes up by $50. And now our multiplier is 1. The foreigner spends $50 in the United States, and income goes up by $50. But then the grocery store owner and the rancher and the whoever else I said, butcher and the farmer, they all say, collectively, hey, our incomes have gone up by $50. And then they say, well, with this extra $50, I can afford to spend some more money now. So their incomes have risen, and they're going to spend out of that $50, $25 just to go out and say, well, since I'm better off than I used to be, income-wise, I'm going to spend a little bit more. We had a consumption function, if you remember, that looked like this. Here's Q and C, and the consumption function had a slope to it. We're saying here the slope's 50%, or 0.5. Anyway, well, all we're saying here is that the farmer and the butcher and the vegetable farmer and everybody else, their incomes have gone up by $50 as a result of that first round of spending, and I'm saying now they're going to spend some of that $50. How much? 50% of it. That's my assumption here was the MPC is 50%. So out of that 50, and what do they do with the other $50? Save it. You remember about the MPC plus the MPS equals 1. 100% of that income, you spend 50%, that must mean you're saving the other 50%. So, the farmer and the rancher and the butcher and the grocer, they've got an extra $50 worth of income times their 50% MPC, they spend $25. Where do they spend it? Oh, maybe one of them goes and gets a haircut. One of them goes to a restaurant here in town. One of them buys a bicycle for his kid. Or uses part of that to buy the bicycle. And so now that $25 worth of spending becomes income of somebody else. I better be writing these down. $50 was from the initial foreigner spending the money in the United States, which became income. Then the people who got that income, they spent $25. And so they spend their $25 getting, as I say, the haircut and eating dinner and buying a bicycle. And now the people who manufacture bicycles and the people who cut hair, those would be barbers, and the people who, what was my other example, the owner of the restaurant and the waiters and the waitresses and the cooks, they say, wow, look, $25 came in. There's our income went up by 25 bucks. And since our MPC is 50%, let's spend $12 and a half. And so their income goes up, so they spend the 12 and a half, and that becomes income for somebody else. And that somebody else says, wow, our income went up by $12 and a half. Let's spend 50% of it, $6 and a quarter. What's the next one going to be? $3, 12 and a half cents. And the next one going to be $1.56 and 3/4, or I don't even know what's going to be. But the point is that even though these numbers are getting smaller, each one's 50% of the one before, but the point is that that original injection of spending into the economy of $50, that created 50 plus 25 plus 1250 plus 625, that created additional income. And what do all these add up to? If we just carried this out to the last penny, what would they add up to? And the answer is $100, just like I told you. There's a multiplier effect. Let me give this example, or change the example slightly, and take you as an example. Maybe you live in Kansas City or St. Louis. You move to Springfield. Maybe you pay, oh, I don't know, your living costs, everything like that. Maybe you're going to spend $7,000 a year in Springfield. So, in effect, you move from St. Louis or Kansas City to Springfield. You bring $7,000 with you. You scattered around town. I think mainly in the nightclubs and bars. But anyway, you spend the $7,000 around town, and the people who run the nightclubs and bars and the landlords and everybody else, they say, wow, $7,000 worth of income. And then some of them go out and get a haircut, and some of them eat dinner at the restaurant, and some of them do whatever, but they spend that $7,000 worth of income, or part of it, and that becomes income for somebody else. And then that somebody else says, wow, I got some more income, and then they spend that, and it becomes income for someone else. And before you know it, even though you brought $7,000 to Springfield, it turns into maybe $15,000 worth of income in Springfield. So Springfield says, thank you, students. As a matter of fact, I know a little bit about this. I've done something called economic impact studies. For SMS. And it's exactly about the thing I just described to you. Let me just mention to you, and this has been a couple of years ago, but students were bringing, let me move these numbers out of the way, or these marks, and students brought into Springfield, and this has been 2 or 3 years ago, but $139.5 million. That is to say, as a result of SMS's students being here, going to school, that is responsible for an extra $139.5 million worth of spending in the Springfield economy. That autonomous spending shifts up by that much. We've got a multiplier for students of 2.264. And so the total impact, that is to say this total increase in Springfield, it's not GDP, what would it be? GCP, gross city product, 315.9 million. As a result of you and other students. Really, it's a result of SMS being here, attracting the students in, keeping some students from leaving town who would ordinarily have graduated from high school and gone to college elsewhere. SMS is here, they stay here in town. But students being here, going to school, is responsible for Springfield's contribution to real GDP going up by a little over almost $316 million. So these things that, what we're talking about now, it has some practical application. Now, this is a good model, this is in my opinion, this is a good model for looking at Springfield because Springfield really kind of does have an aggregate supply curve that looks like this. We're not in a depression, but the point is that if there's more and more students move into Springfield and start spending money, people will move to Springfield from surrounding communities to get jobs. We'll just have lots and lots of jobs, and we don't have a limit on the number of workers that can, get jobs here in Springfield. Why? Well, because, as I say, they can just move into town and go to work. There's a limit for the United States economy where that we can't just keep on adding more and more and more jobs, but in a local economy you can. So what I'm saying is there is sort of a horizontal aggregate supply curve for Springfield, and I'm saying students are responsible for shifting that curve out to the right. So are faculty, so are the university's expenditures on buildings, such as when it built this one, and so forth. The total impact of all SMS, students, faculty, money that would not be spent in Springfield if not for SMS being here, the total, I won't go into all the details here, but the total impact is down here on GDP, $517 million. So students are responsible for more than, well over half of about 60%, 65%. Okay? So again, what I've really been talking about here, although I'm illustrating it with this SMS case, what I'm really illustrating is the fact that an increase in autonomous spending of whatever the amount is, $1, it will, after it's spent and respent again and by the recipients, it will actually cause total incomes in the economy and GDP in the economy to rise by a multiple of that dollar. How much? How much is the multiple? Not in this SMS case, but just in general, we've got a formula for that multiplier, and the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So if I tell you the multiplier, if I tell you the MPC, you ought to know how much the multiplier is. If I tell you MPC equals 0.5, you remember what the MPC is? Change in consumption spending divided by change in income. It's the fraction of each dollar's worth of income that gets spent, incremental dollar. If the MPC is 0.5, then the multiplier is equal to 2. 1 over 1 minus 0.5 equals 1 over 0.5 equals 2. Let's say the MPC is 0.75. Each incremental dollar's worth of income, we spend 3/4 of it. Then this multiplier is 1 over 1 minus 0.75 equals 1 over 0.25 equals 4. Let's do one or two more. You'll need to do these on the exam, so don't become too complacent about these. Let's say the MPC is 0.9. Then the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.9 equals 1 over 0.1 equals 10. This multiplier effect, it applies to anything that shifts this curve up right here. It applies to shifts in autonomous spending. And when you get that change in autonomous spending, then we multiply by the multiplier. And that tells us the change in equilibrium GDP. Why don't I just not do any more today other than suggest to you that over the next few days you make up a few of these problems for yourself and get some experience doing the calculations, and that way tests will be a little bit easier. So long, I'll see you next time.